So today we are welcoming someone who is very special to me, and we're very lucky to have her here on this campus. Her name is Jessie Lee Kercheval, and she is a poet, fiction writer, memoirist, and translator, and teacher at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She directs the creative writing program there. She was born in France and raised in Washington, D.C. and Florida, and she currently goes back and forth between Madison, Wisconsin, and Montevideo, Uruguay. And I know that we have some soccer people around here, including two in this row, and she is also a soccer person, so you have to talk, or fútbol, as it's called in Spanish. Yeah, my name is Janine Pitas, for those of you who don't know me. I teach here in language and literature, English and Spanish. And my introduction to Jessie was quite special and unexpected, actually. So I had done some work myself in Uruguay and translated some poetry from Spanish to English. And a few years later, after I was back home, I received a message from an Uruguayan friend of mine who said, Jessie Lee Kercheval sends you greetings. And I immediately thought, who's this? I don't know this person who's sending me greetings. And I looked her up online, and I saw this long Wikipedia entry of someone who had published 15 books and won numerous awards and been published in the New Yorker magazine, and I was just completely dumbfounded that this eminent writer was sending me greetings, and it turned out it was just because we had this common interest. So of everything that Jessie Lee does, all her poetry, her fiction, her memoir, it's all very impressive. But to me, what is most impressive is that she began learning Spanish as a foreign language at the age of 50. So if any of you think that, learning a foreign language is hard or it can't be done, here is your counter argument about to come up here and speak to you. And she has since become very much, just very devoted to Latin American and especially Uruguayan literature. She has compiled various anthologies of poets from Uruguay. She has done a lot of translation work herself. And just to make sure before we start, do you all know where Uruguay is? Because not everyone knows. So what continent is it on? South America, good. And what two large countries is it near, that does it border? Argentina and Brazil, excellent. Okay, just so that we make sure that we know where we are, because a lot of people from Uruguay, they get really frustrated when they're talking to people on the internet and people say to them, oh, is your country in Africa, so yeah, they've never heard of it. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Jessie. Let's all welcome her.
A little shorter. Yeah, well, Janine undersells herself because I had contacted her or knew about her because she's the translator of a very important, wonderful Uruguayan poet, Moroso de Xoxo. And also, that was a kind of Uruguayan thing. Uruguay is a country with 3 million people, so the first person you ask doesn't know someone, the second person does. That's the fact that I could get a message to Janine when I didn't know where she was in North America. I'm going to wear a couple of different hats tonight. Janine asked me to read prose as well as poetry. Usually more popular. And instead of reading one of my novels, I decided to read from my memoir, Space, which has been out for a while, but just got reissued in a lovely new paperback this year. So I've been doing some readings from it and sort of falling back in love with the book. It's about growing up in Florida. I grew up down near the Kennedy Space Center during the moon race. And so I'm going to read a little chunk of a chapter sort of in the middle of the book, but it stands alone. And what you need to know as I start into it, this isn't fiction. This is real. This is my life, for better or for worse. I once sent some of this to an editor, and they wrote back and said, oh, how could, I don't like this little girl. How would you like to be stuck on a long car trip with her? And I thought, it's me. I was stuck on a long car trip with her. Like a long, long car trip. But anyway, this chapter takes place in October 1968, and it's set in Cocoa, Florida, which is right across from Cape Canaveral or Cape Kennedy. I'm 12, and I'm madly in love with a boy named Paul Malteso. Paul Malteso was drowning, and only I could save him. Mrs. Henry, our swimming instructor, had picked Paul to play the victim for my junior life-saving test because she knew he couldn't say no. His sister Lynn was taking the test too. Paul was 15, the 9th grade class president at Clear Lake Junior High School, the Rockets. And Lynn and he was tall and tanned, and he was a god. Lynn and I were both just 12, only a month into the world of 7th grade and junior high. Could you rescue a god? I had to try. I dove in and swam straight toward Paul, looking for an easy hold, but he was a panicky drowner. He had already passed senior life-saving and knew exactly what I would try. He grabbed my hair and he tried to pull me under. I jerked my head, leaving some blonde hair in his hand, and tried again. This time he kicked me hard right where I didn't have breasts to speak of yet, and I sank, pretending he'd knocked the wind out of me. Then I dove deep, came up behind him, and got him in a good cross-chest lock. I side-stroked the two of us towards the end of the pool. Paul wasn't done yet. He threw his legs high in the air, and we went under. When we came up, both of us were coughing. I felt Mrs. Henry's eyes on me. She raised her stopwatch. I had maybe another minute, and we were only halfway to the shallow end. Paul rocked sideways, trying to break my hold. He was bigger and stronger, and I couldn't believe he was being so unfair. I dug my nails into his side, as deep and as hard as I could. Christ, he said, but he stopped squirming. We made it to the concrete steps, and I half-dragged, half-carried him out of the pool. Time, Jessie, Mrs. Henry called out. Her stopwatch clicked. You just made it. She offered me her hand. Congratulations. Thank you, Mrs. Henry, I said. Standing in the grass by the side of the pool, Paul showed off 4 red, curved dents my nails had left. Mrs. Henry touched her fingers to his scarred brown side, her blonde head bent over his. She was divorced, and everyone but me called her Lucille. My, she said and laughed, and I stood with my legs wrapped tight around each other, trying to disappear. To my surprise, Paul brushed the dripping hair out of his eyes and smiled at me, not Mrs. Henry. Scarred for life, he said. That night, Paul was on the evening news and in the local paper the next morning. He and 2 of his friends from the science class were going into space. That is, they were going to lock themselves in the Malteso's Airstream travel trailer and not leave it for as long as the upcoming Apollo 7 mission lasted. Apollo 7 was the first moon mission since Apollo 1 had burned up on the pad. They had the principal's permission to miss school. Yeah, Lynn said when I asked her about it. Can you believe it? He'll miss almost 2 weeks of school. Too bad girls can't be astronauts. I nodded. A year ago, it had seemed impossibly unfair that women couldn't be astronauts, real astronauts. Now I was only bummed that it meant I couldn't blast off in Malteso's Airstream and spend 10 days nearly alone in space with Paul. She said she might not be getting out of any classes, but that her mother had promised she could have a slumber party on Friday, a week after the launch. She could invite up to 10 girls, 1 for every day Apollo 7 was supposed to be in space. Paul and his friends would still be orbiting in the Malteso's yard. I thought about Paul asleep inside his aluminum skin capsule just yards from where we would be making popcorn and pizza in the Malteso's kitchen. If I couldn't be with him, at least I could be close. Please, God, I thought, as Lynn told me, let me be one of the chosen. She invited me that afternoon on the bus and also asked my sister Carol, which made it certain that I could go. On Friday, the day of the launch, Paul and the other mock astronauts were home, loading their silver capsule, running a last check of supplies with Mrs. Malteso. They had a chemical toilet, instructions from Mr. Donner, their science teacher, for a set of authentic space experiments, and a deck of cards in case they got bored. They also had several cases of baby food, the closest they could come to what the astronauts ate. All the windows were covered with aluminum foil with tiny holes poked in it, so the sunlight shining through would look like the stars in the black night of space. All morning at school, I wished I were there, outside Paul's Airstream rocket. If I couldn't be an astronaut, I could be the perfect flight controller, handmaiden to the gods. Instead, I had PE, then science, where we'd been stuck on the reproduction of liverworts for quite some time. Then the principal came on the intercom and said we could all file out onto the driver's range to watch the launch. At 11 a.m., Shira and the others headed across the blue Florida sky, trailing white smoke. The blast rattled in the windows of the 20 portable classrooms, the portable bathroom, and the portable lunchroom it took to house and service all us extra space kids. No doubt it rattled the windows of the Airstream where Paul and his friends sat, strapped into lawn chairs rigged for the purpose. "We have liftoff," the controllers at the Cape said. "Blast off," Mrs. Malteso said into her walkie-talkie to Paul, waving to the boys so they couldn't see her. "Bon voyage." On Saturday afternoon, half the neighborhood gathered in the Malteso's yard. Mrs. Malteso had set up refreshments on the picnic table. There were squares of special astronaut's fruitcake she had baked for the boys to take into orbit. The recipe, clipped from the paper, was beside the plate. Quote, "This fruitcake, identical to the ones the astronauts eat in space," it read, "has energy power aplenty for us Earthlings who live on this globe's field of gravity." I took a square and bit into it. It tasted just like the fruitcake my mother's brother in Texas sent us every year, which is to say, it tasted awful. I spit out my first bite into my hand, then dropped the whole piece discreetly onto the lawn under the picnic table where I had hoped some neighborhood dog would find it. About 7 pieces were already there. So far, no dogs had been interested. As I helped myself to a cupcake with a tiny American flag on a toothpick in it, Mrs. Malteso came over and poured me a glass of Tang, drink of the astronauts. She asked me if I had heard the news. "What news?" I said. "The president called." "Our president?" I almost dropped my orange drink. Mrs. Malteso nodded. "LBJ." She looked pleased, but I couldn't help thinking my mother would have been more than pleased. She would have been speechless, awestruck to speak to Johnson, if only he'd been the kind of kid who merited a call from the president. Mrs. Malteso went on. "First thing this morning woke us up. He saw a piece about the boys on Walter Cronkite and wanted to talk to Paul. And so he had, though only briefly. Paul, standing on principle, had refused to leave the Airstream to come to the phone. So Mrs. Malteso had to hold the walkie-talkie up to the receiver. The president was both pleased and proud. "A new generation is readying itself for space," President Johnson had told Mr. Malteso, who had 2 Nixon signs stuck in his yard. By Thursday, when I stopped by the Malteso's house in my bathing suit to get Lynn for swimming lessons, the yard was empty except for the Airstream. Only the picnic table served as a reminder of Saturday's excitement. Lynn was slumped in a lawn chair, picking nail polish off her toenails and talking to Paul on the walkie-talkie. "No," she was saying, "I don't see why I should run down the battery on my transistor radio just so you boys can hear music. If you're bored, go walk in space." She rolled her eyes. "All they do is complain. The toilet smells. All the baby food except the vanilla pudding tastes awful. The seeds for their experiment didn't sprout. They're bored," she sighed. "I'm bored. Here, you talk to them. I'm going to go inside and get my swimsuit." I pressed the button on the walkie-talkie. "Hey," I said, "Earth to Paul." "Lynn?" Paul's voice crackled back. It somehow seemed easier to talk to him when I couldn't see him. "Jessie," I said, "you know, the girl who saved your life." "Well, hello there, lifesaver." I asked him what he was doing, and he said they were playing poker for the last jars of pudding. After that, all that was left was strained peas and fruitcake. "Can you see me?" I asked, looking at my reflection in the Airstream. The curved aluminum skin made me look tall and languid, like a model by the side of some gorgeous magazine pool. "No, not unless I peeked under the aluminum foil," Paul said, "and that would be cheating." "You wouldn't cheat?" "No," Paul said, "I wouldn't." But one of the other boys was less scrupulous. I heard him say, "Hey, who's the skinny kid in the bathing suit? Your girlfriend?" And then Paul released the button, cutting off communication. My face turned bright red with embarrassment. "Who's the skinny kid?" Lynn reappeared. She didn't seem to notice. "Come on," she said, "we're late." We needn't have hurried, though. We were supposed to be practicing our diving. I could never keep my feet together. But as soon as we got to the pool, it started to thunder and lightning. Then it poured. "Out of the pool, girls," Mrs. Henry said, clapping her hands. And we sat out the downpour on Mrs. Henry's long screen porch, which had big piles of magazines. Mrs. Henry disappeared into the pump house beside the pool to do something with the filters. We sat there flipping through the fashion magazines, peeling apart pages stuck together with humidity to peer at women with wide eyes, lashes sticky with mascara, and chests almost as flat as ours. In my house, we never had these kind of magazines, only Time and Reader's Digest and National Geographic. Mrs. Maltezo arrived, pulling her Cadillac up close to the screen back door so Lynn could run out. I picked up another magazine. 10 Ways Men Like to Be Kissed, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Page 154, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, the cover read. I was trying to unstick page 154 from 155 when Mrs. Henry reappeared with 2 tall aluminum tumblers of iced tea. She set them on the table, glancing at the magazine. She lit a mentholated cigarette. "What is it you need to know about kissing?" she said. She was wearing a white 2-piece suit, and her skin was the deep, even brown of dark Cairo syrup. I thought about it. I needed to know everything. "How do you get a boy to kiss you?" Mrs. Henry didn't laugh. She took a deep drag on her cigarette, giving me the question serious thought. "Pretend I'm a boy. Stand up," she said. "Closer." She took my shoulders between her 2 slender brown fingers and maneuvered me until my toes were touching hers. "First, tilt your head back," she said, putting one finger under my chin and lifting it. "Then, wet your lips." I licked them nervously, once, twice. "Now," Mrs. Henry said, breathing out a cloud of mentholated smoke, "close your eyes." And Mrs. Henry lightly touched her lips to mine. I smelled suntan lotion and the chlorine in her hair. "There," she said, stepping back, "easy as pie. Any boy would be crazy not to want to kiss you." And she handed me my glass of tea. I licked my lips. They tasted like Mrs. Henry. When my mother dropped my sister Carol and I off at the Maltezos, it was still light, the red and purple of the sunset glinting off the silver back of the Airstream in the yard. None of us went outside to talk to Paul or the other boys on the walkie-talkie, though I'd been wanting to do that all day. Ignoring Paul somehow felt better. Let him swing alone through the darkness of space, I thought, as we spread out the pizza dough from the Chef Boyardee mixes, dribbled them with bright canned sauce and grainy canned cheese. As my sister Carol, who'd been supervising, was about to stick the first one in the oven, Mrs. Maltezo said, "Wait." She'd bought pepperoni to make it more like real Italian pizza, and we watched as she added the slices, dealing them out like a deck of round cards. While we were busy in the kitchen, Lynn took pictures of us with her father's old Polaroid land camera. This was no simple white plastic swinger, but a huge contraption with a bellows and a bulb flash that was almost too heavy for Lynn to lift. The pictures, when they came out, were small and square. Lynn gave each shot exactly 1 moment to develop, then peeled back the sticky cover sheet, and there we were, in black and white, flour on our noses and hands deep in the dough, dancing around with the little cans of cheese. The pictures curled into tight cylinders almost immediately, and you couldn't touch them or they stuck to your fingers. After she shot the whole roll, Lynn rubbed each picture with some kind of special milky solution that came in its own applicator the size of one of my mother's red lipsticks. That keeps them from fading, she says. In the morning, everyone can take one home. We ate the pizzas, which were great, soft and greasy and terrifically salty. "Man," Lynn said, "I bet we're going to have nightmares." "Not if we stay up all night," I said. And after that, we changed into our PJs and watched Theater X, the late-night movie show the high school kids all watched. Some astronauts landed on the moon of Jupiter and discovered alien life in the form of a bunch of lonely young women in high heels. It was called Fire Maidens of Outer Space. This is a true movie. And the dance numbers were especially good. Look it up. When the movie was over at midnight, Carol announced she was going to Lynn's bedroom to sleep. "If anyone," she looked right at me, "wakes me up, I will personally kill them." And Janie, the baby of the group, and 3 other girls decided they would try to sleep on the shag carpet in the family room, and they headed off, trailing blankets and pillows. I had sworn I wasn't going to sleep at all, but now it seemed like a good idea to lie down for a while, and I headed for the family room too, with its deep green and orange shag. Lynn came in and found a place near the fireplace. Maybe she had even given in to the idea of resting for a while. I closed my eyes. Just a moment, I said to myself, and the house was quiet except for the breathing of 11 girls, asleep or nearly so, and somewhere 2 parents, hopefully sound asleep too. The next thing I knew, I dreamed that I was draped like a pepperoni on top of a giant pizza. An equally giant set of teeth were eating their way down the slice towards my greasy, naked body. I screamed and sat up, my heart racing, my pajamas drenched in sweat. Lynn was there. "If you're awake," she said, taking me by the hand, pulling me to my feet, "then come on. I've got a great idea." She dragged me into the kitchen. A nearly whole pizza was left on the marble counter. She handed it to me. "No, please," I said. I couldn't eat another bite. Lynn shook her head. "It's not for you." She grabbed a couple of bottles of Coke from the refrigerator and tucked them under her arm. Then she grabbed the big Polaroid camera. We went out into the yard. The grass was cool and damp under my bare feet. It was quiet except for the tree frogs and very dark. The moon was nowhere to be seen, but the neighbors' yard lights were still on. Lynn set the Cokes on the picnic table and motioned for me to do the same with the pizza. Then she sat down on the table too, her legs crossed. "Boy," she said in an unnaturally loud voice, loud enough to wake the neighbors, certainly loud enough to wake Paul, "there's nothing like a midnight snack of pepperoni pizza and cold Coca-Cola. I'm so glad we came out here to eat it, but now I'm so full and so tired." She faked a yawn so big I caught the silvery glint of one of her molars. "Let's go back to bed," she said, "and just leave this old pizza for the squirrels. I couldn't eat another bite." We left the picnic table and crouched behind Mrs. Maltezo's Cadillac, Lynn holding the Polaroid at ready, as if she were one of the reporters stalking Jackie Kennedy in Greece. The frogs sang. The palm trees in the front yard rustled dryly. Reflections from the neighbors' lights glistened on the pepperoni, and the cheese glowed with a light of its own. I could see the Cokes sweating. Then I heard a click, like the sound of a small mousetrap snapping shut. Someone had popped the latch on the Airstream's door. Roger London came out first. Tall, bony, he unfolded himself from the trailer with the awkward angularity of a praying mantis. I hoped it hadn't been Roger who called me skinny. Next came a boy whose name I could never remember. He was very short, shorter than me, and had a reputation as both a good surfer and the senior class clown. Roger's head swiveled on his shoulders, checking things out, making him look more than ever like some kind of bug. "It's all clear," he called over his shoulder into the trailer. Roger and the clown had already reached the picnic table and the pizza by the time Paul appeared at the trailer door. He stood there, eyes wide, his frown reminding me of the worried baby face I'd seen in the family pictures in the Maltezo's home. He looked awfully cute. "I don't know," he said. "Oh, come on, boy astronaut," the little class clown said, with a nasal voice I recognized from the walkie-talkie. He was the one who'd made fun of the way I looked. "Step out on the surface of the moon for a little pizza." Then Paul stepped out of the trailer, but he didn't head for the pizza the way the other 2 boys had. He stared at the bushes that lined the driveway, stretched and strolled toward the oleanders, as if they had been what he missed most in space. "Better hurry up," Roger said, his mouth full of pizza. "We're not saving you any." "Give me a minute," Paul said. He had reached the oleanders. Lynn made a sound with her tongue like a chicken's cluck. When she was taking a math test, this sound always meant she had come up with the right answer. "Perfecto mundo," she said under her breath, and in a split second she was up and aiming her camera. When the flash bulb exploded, it became clear what Paul was doing. I saw his penis sticking out of his fly, slim and beautiful as any rocket, and a long golden stream watering the oleander. "What?" I heard Roger say, frozen with a piece of pizza halfway to his mouth. "Crap," I heard the other boy, Mr. Funnyman, say. And Paul turned toward the flash, though he must have been nearly blind from the sudden burst of light, and said in a low, clear voice, "Lynn Megan Maltezo, you are dead meat." Lynn tore the picture out of the camera and thrust it into my astonished hand. "Run," she said to me. "Don't let him get it." And I heard a low growl coming from Paul's direction, and I took off down the driveway and into the street. I heard footsteps on the asphalt behind me. The pavement was rough, but I had calluses on my feet thick enough to stand a slow walk over live coals. I hadn't been running barefoot all these years for nothing. I kept going, heading downhill for the Indian River. My feet flew, and in the dark, my strides were as long and fluid as they would have been on the moon. I was flying. If I jumped high enough, I could escape gravity altogether and go tumbling through space. I held tight to the picture. After I crossed the river road and reached the overgrown bank, I looked back. Paul was following me. The other boys had either ducked back into the trailer or were chasing Lynn. Paul was running so fast, he seemed to be flying, too. I scrambled through the bushes, down the bank, out onto the Maltezos dock. It was a long dock, but not one in good repair. I didn't care. I ran down at full tilt, my feet hammering the rickety wooden planking. "Jesse," Paul called from the bank, "watch out." "Coward," I called back over my shoulder, slowing down a little as I picked my way over the missing boards. Paul hit the dock fast. He knew where the rotten spots were and was gaining on me. I concentrated on my feet. Careful, keep going, careful. It was even darker on the river than it had been in the Maltezos' front yard. Then I was at the end of the dock. "Give me the picture, Jess," Paul said. He was right behind me. I jumped. For an instant, I was floating, like somehow I was suddenly in space. And then my feet touched the water, and immediately after, the slimy mud of the river's bottom. The water at the end of the dock was only up to my thighs. Water, ripe, sulfurous bubbles rose on all sides of me, and I could feel the muck soaking into my pajamas. But I still had the picture. I tucked it into the back waistband of my pajamas. Paul collapsed on his stomach at the end of the dock. "Phew," he said, smelling the sulfur. He was panting, out of shape after his week in space. "Give me that damn picture," he said, breathing hard. I was just beyond his reach, unless he too wanted to come wading. I shook my head. "I dropped it," I said. Paul looked at me. "You really don't have it?" I held up my empty hands. Paul looked at me and sighed. "You're crazy, you know that?" I nodded. I was the one standing thigh-deep in the river, so I must be crazy. I wasn't, however, the one who just spent 8 days in a sweaty, stinky trailer with 2 nasty boys and was about to lock myself in for 3 more. "Here," he said, offering me his hand. I put one mucky foot on the end of the dock for a leg up, and he stood and pulled, and somehow, not too gracefully, I managed to climb out of the river. Then we walked hand in hand, very carefully, back down the broken dock to the bank, water dripping from my PJs. When we got to dry land, I tilted my head back and I licked my lips twice. Paul kissed me, like he couldn't help it. He tasted like astronaut fruitcake. No doubt, I tasted like pepperoni pizza. "Jesse," it was Lynn on the road above us. Paul froze. "Is that you? Have you got the picture?" I did. I could feel it inside the waistband of my PJs, the elastic making it cut ever so tightly and slightly into the small of my back. But I wanted to keep it. "No," I said. I dropped it. "Damn it," she said. I could see her face now, a white blob peering down from high on the bank. "Is that Paul? Hold on to him. I've still got the camera." And Paul took off running down the sandy edge of the river and then up the neighbor's wooden steps to the road. And by the time I got back to the Maltezos, all 3 boys were back in the Airstream, and the pizza and Cokes were gone, and a thin sliver of moon was beginning to rise. Okay. Taking off my prose writing hat, putting on my poetry hat for a moment. I'm going to read just a couple of my own poems, and then I'm going to read some translated poems. When I was in Uruguay, learning Spanish. I just decided I wanted to learn Spanish. I decided it was crazy to have grown up in Florida and to live in the United States of America without knowing Spanish. And so I went to Uruguay on a sabbatical year, which is a year off you get from being a professor to study something, to be a student again. And I just plunged into studying Spanish. And when I was there, I started writing poems in Spanish because I was trying to live a completely Spanish life, and I always write poems. And then later, I translated them into English. That was actually my first translation project. I had to translate my own poems, which I found surprisingly difficult. At first, they seemed like they had been put through Google Translate. But I got better at it. And I began going to poetry readings in Uruguay because I'm a poet, and that's what I do. And they're often readings like 5 or 8 young poets in a bar. And it's kind of rude to just keep showing up and listening to other people's poems without reading something. It's kind of very cooperative. So they asked me to read, and I think they expected I would stand up and read poems in English and that they would not understand them. But I stood up and I read some in Spanish, and they liked them, and I kept doing that. And then this wonderful poet who has a press in Uruguay called Jagaru, which is Uruguay backwards, asked me for the poems, and they published in this lovely little book, which is called Stranger Extranjera. It's the same word in English and Spanish. And I was just going to read one, but because you mentioned football, I'm going to read two. This is the absolutely most popular poem in Uruguay when I read it. If I'm on the radio, which I've been a bunch of times, someone always asks for this poem because the people in Uruguay are obsessed with soccer. Like, I don't know, we have war, they have football. And I'm obsessed with the national football team of Uruguay, and which is exceptionally, amazingly good for a tiny, tiny country. And Uruguay was the host of the first World Cup in 1930. You're going to get me started on this, I'll never stop. But I only got to see the national team in person once, because most of them play in Europe, right? They only come to play like the World Cup. But I got to see a friendly between Holland and Uruguay in Estadio Centenario, which is the stadium that was built for the first World Cup in 1930. And this is called football. Futbol. This year in Montevideo, I have fallen in love for the first time all over again. I am burning with desire for my team, La Celeste. I know all the players' names, have seen their faces so often on TV that when they take the field, they are boys I have known my whole life. Mulera, Lugano, Godin, Cáceres, Pereira, Rios, Gargano, Perez, Abreu, Cavani, Suarez, Forlan. I am not alone, and I am not alone. For this friendly against Holland, the stands are celeste, 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 the color of the June sky. And the only two dots of orange are the Dutch ambassador and his wife. One game, but more than a game. One day in autumn, but more than a day. We sing in Estadio Centenario where Uruguay won the first World Cup, Soy Celeste. And we chant in this city where the world came to play, Vamos Uruguay. And we win. On penalties, at the last possible moment, but we win, and I have never been so happy. Then I'm going to read one that leads into the next thing. This is called Atlántida, Uruguay. Uruguay has gorgeous coasts. If I want to be the Uruguay tourist board, why you should go visit Uruguay. I'm from Florida. The beaches in Uruguay, much, much better. And there are all these little beach towns that are sort of like, I don't know, every 10 kilometers, there's a different little beach town. And this one's called Atlántida. Atlántida, Uruguay. In this corner of the world, in this corner where two dusty roads meet, in this corner of a house with a thatched roof that was built as a gas station before there was a national highway. In a living room big enough to park 4 cars, where there is only a hammock and a table, I sit on a late summer afternoon and write these words. In her bed, the grandmother of the house is sleeping. The others have gone to the beach to sunbathe or swim in the sea, but not me. And not the 2 dogs of the house asleep at my feet, or the cat sleeping at my side. Or the flies on the table sleep too and dream of the food that will be served at dinner. My eyes begin to close. In a moment, I will sleep like my companions and dream of I know not what, the oceans that cover 2/3 of the world, or the fish in the sea more numerous than the stars in the sky, or the theories of philosophers, or simply of dinner, like the flies. And I read that one because it leads into the first few translation poems I'm going to read. When I was staying at this house, which belongs to a friend of mine, Uruguayans, it was Epiphany. And in Uruguay, as in many countries, as a matter of fact, it's even true in Germany, I was about to say in many Hispanic countries, the 3 kings come by. You know, they're looking for baby Jesus, and if you put your shoes out with a little straw to lure the camels, the 3 kings will stop and leave presents in your shoes. And mostly this is for kids, but in this family, everybody did it. And my friend, Carlos, the father of the family, he got a blue ukulele shaped like a pineapple. And I got a big fat poetry book, the collected poems of a poet named Circe Maya. And Circe is in her 80s, and she's really probably one of the greatest living Uruguayan poets. I would say the greatest living Uruguayan poet. And I just sat there, actually, right when I was writing this poem, in Atlántida, in that living room where everybody else was at the beach, and I read this whole big fat book of poems. And I was pretty new to translation, and she's such a wonderful poet, and everyone in Uruguay knew her. I thought I would come home and I would be able to get copies of her books that were all translated and give them to my friends so they could read them in English. And it turns out, I don't know, like 5 of her poems have ever been translated. And I just thought that was so unfair. So because this is Uruguay, what I said, everybody knows everybody, I asked my friend who got the blue ukulele if he knew how to get in touch with her, and he said, oh yeah, she was my high school teacher, here's her email address. And so I emailed her and I said, I'd like to translate some poems to have them in magazines so people can read your work. And she said, oh, that's lovely. And I sent them out and they began being taken like mad, like one was in the New Yorker. And so then I did a whole book of her poems, and this is called El Puente Invisible, The Invisible Bridge. And so these are poems selected from, this huge book. It's her 10 books that she's published in her life. And I'm going to read like 4 of them. And in a change from anything funny, I would say, earlier, one of the things that's true about Uruguay and many countries in Latin America is that it had a terrible military dictatorship from the 70s till 1985. And many people were killed and people were disappeared. And probably the most thing that Circe is known for outside of Uruguay are actually the lyrics to a song that was a very famous protest song recorded by a guy named Daniel Vigletti, who's often called the Bob Dylan of Uruguay. So a lot of people know this song, but this is the poem version of it. The song is called Otra Voz Canta, but these are the lyrics as a poem, and it's about the disappeared, the people who just went to prison and never came back. Behind my voice. Behind my voice, listen, listen, another voice sings. It comes from behind, from far, it comes from the buried mouths, and it sings. They say, we are not dead. Listen to them, while the voice rises, remembers them, and sings. Listen, another voice sings. They say they live now in your eyes. Sustain them with your eyes, with your words, so they are not lost, so they do not fall. They are not only memory. They are open to life, open wide. Listen, listen, another voice sings. And Circe had a very personal connection to this. Her husband, Ariel, was a doctor, and the military police came to arrest actually both Ariel and Circe, and they only left Circe because she'd just given birth to her daughter. And so her husband was taken off to prison, and she didn't know if she'd ever see him again. And so when you read some of these poems, if you realize what date they were published, they're especially just, moving. So this one's called Treason. The last son did not say to him, I am the last son. Nothing prepared him. The water slid over his body, and he didn't know this was the way that the water said goodbye. He did not know. No one told him anything. When night came, it came to stay, and he never knew. Now, I should say that Ariel, who's in his 90s, is alive. But, for example, and he was a doctor until really quite recently, considering how old he is. But, for example, he'll never sleep a night away from his own home because of his time in prison. They have a little cottage that's like, I don't know, a mile outside of town on a lake, but he won't stay there. But this is a poem this actually was the poem that was in the New Yorker. And Circe has a beautiful garden in the back of her house, and everything, she loves flowers, she loves plants. And this is a very Circe poem. It's called Hummingbirds. It's about someone else's garden, but it's very Circe, hummingbirds. I thought she was exaggerating a little when she said to me that every one of her hummingbirds, she had 5, had a distinct name, and they flew freely in her garden, where they had distinct feeders. If not, they fight too much. But it was just like that, just like that. I saw them once when the house alone invited a visit to the open back garden. There they came, flying like tiny winged messengers, with urgent notices and warnings. No name fit them well. Useless words. Astonishment at the rapid movement of the wings, the not being able to look at them, the approach of their tiny hearts beating so incredibly rapidly, close, very close, then suddenly shooting off, high, unattainable, beings of our world, but also of another, only theirs. I'm going to read one last poem of Circe's. Circe actually lives in a town called Tacuarembó. Uruguay has 3.3 million people, and 1.5 million of them live in the capital, Montevideo, including pretty much all the poets. And Cersei instead lives in this little town up by the Brazilian border, which people in Uruguay kind of use as like the definition of the middle of nowhere. They're from Tacuarembó. But people make the pilgrimage up to see Cersei. Like, so when I finally went to see her after I'd been translating her work, and I go all the time now, it's a 5-hour bus ride. And when you get there, she invites you through her house and into her back garden. And so this poem is really sort of her doing that to you, her readers. And if you imagine there in the back garden at the end, sitting under her lemon tree, it's called Invitation. I would like you to hear my voice. Wish I could hear yours. Yes, yes, I'm talking to you, silent gaze that runs over these lines. You disapprove, perhaps, of this impossible desire to escape paper and ink. What will we say to each other? I don't know, but it has to be better than always talking to myself, turning phrases and sounds, placing and removing parentheses and putting them in again. If your voice interrupts and breaks this very line, come in. I was waiting for you, this way. Let's go into the garden. There are fruit trees. You will see. Come. And I'm going to close with 2 short poems, just because I want you to know they're really young poets in Uruguay. When I started going to the bars and things where there were readings, I met a lot of young poets, and so I started this idea of put together this anthology, which is 23 poets under 40, some in their 20s, some of them in their 40. For some reason, being a poet, if you're younger, you're under 40. Like, they give you a lot of extra time. I think if you're a fiction writer, you're only younger if you're under, like, 25. And I matched each person up with a different poet translator in the United States. And one of the poets that I really love in this book is named Javier Echevarren, and he wrote a whole book that I've translated. It's coming out in February, called Fable of an Inconsolable Man. And it's a very moving book, very almost directly, brutally straightforward book about growing up very poor in Uruguay. In Uruguay, just to challenge your idea of what South America is like, it's not a particularly poor country. And Uruguayans tend to think of themselves as middle class, even if they would seem a little less middle class sometimes to an American. And most poets are not poor. Football players, yes. Poets don't grow up in poor households, and if they did, they don't write about it. And male poets, I think everywhere in Uruguay, tend to be a little bit less confessional, less sort of talking about their lives than women poets. But this is a book about Javier growing up, and it's just sort of brutally honest. And one of the most sort of straightforward ones is this one. It's called White Rice. White rice with cheese for lunch, and white rice with cheese for dinner. White rice with cheese for lunch, and white rice with cheese for dinner. One variation, white rice without cheese for lunch, and white rice without cheese for dinner. And the hero of this book really is his mother, who keeps his family together after the father abandons the family. And so I'm just going to close with this poem, which is like, I think of it as super mom. I sort of love this. I want a giant drawing of Javier's mom with a cape. It's called My Mother. My mother has 6 arms. Thus, she managed to save her 3 children from that inferno. She runs toward the future, turning her back on the collapsing building, the fire, until they were ashes, and only then allowing us to look back. My mother jumped from a balcony the time the dogs attacked me. She dove into the river and saved my brother Adrien from its fierce current, deflected with a sure blow a fast car to keep my brother Cesar from being hit. My mother saved all 3 of us from hunger, that voracious emptiness that attacks children in broad daylight. But not even time could stop my mother. They died, my father, my grandparents, my uncles, but my mother has decided not to die before her children. That's how powerful she is. Thank you. Are we doing Q&A?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. There's supposed to be some questions, and I will call on you if you don't. A couple of you don't ask questions because I'm a professor and I do that for a living. So, some hands up here. Ask me anything. Really? I'll randomly point at somebody. Okay.
Do you feel when you translate from Spanish into English that you're losing some of the rhythm of the language at all, or do you feel like you keep that pretty?
You always lose some of the rhythm of the language when you translate from Spanish. It's just a much more rhythmic language. It can be a much more easily rhyming language, although the young poets don't tend to rhyme. And I'm always aware of that. And all I can say is I actually had a strange experience sort of back to back. I was giving a talk and a reading at at Tulane University in New Orleans. And one of the poetry professors there, Peter Cooley, said to me, oh, I used to translate, but I've given it up because it's impossible to translate poetry from one language to another. You lose so much music, you lose so much of the sound, it's just impossible. And I thought, well, you might be right, but, I wanted to share this poetry with people who can't read it in Spanish. And then I went down to Uruguay, and I had a chance, right afterwards, the next week. My only chance I had to read with Circe Maya, because Circe lives, remember, in the middle of nowhere, Tacuarembó, and she almost never comes into Montevideo. But there's a big poetry festival, and she wanted to read with me, and so we got to read together, and she read her poems in Spanish, and I read them in English. And one of her 6 daughters, big family, came up to me afterwards, and she said, actually, I like Hummingbird, that particular poem, in English better. It's better than my mother's version. And of course, she's saying that in front of her mom. How cruel can you children be? And I said, no, that's not true. But then when I thought about it, it was because she was just familiar with it in the Spanish version. And so the English version probably seemed fresher or different to her. She's a doctor, so she speaks English. So I would say they're always different poems. But there's no real translating something as if it were invisible. And the more different the language is, I was talking to some of the students here from Saudi Arabia, to translate from a different language like Arabic or Chinese and Turkish into English, you lose more. But, you do what you can do. At least one more question. Then I'll let you go. There aren't even cookies left. One more question. Okay, you can't get cookies until somebody asks a question. I'm going to point at somebody. I know you can ask a question. I'm going to point at the girl in the white sweatshirt. Ask me anything. It doesn't have to be about writing. You can ask me about growing up in Florida. What was it like growing up in Florida? It was like coming to America backwards. Is everybody from the Midwest? No. How many people are from outside of Iowa? Okay, a lot of people. I actually went from Florida to Iowa. I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop at the University of Iowa in Iowa City. And it was like learning about America backwards. If you grew up in Florida, like I've never seen snow, there's no winter, Christmas you put lights up on your palm tree. I don't know, everything's just sort of wrong. And then you go to Iowa, and Iowa's like, the heart of the heart of the heart of everything. It's where people speak without accents and do great on the SATs. And, it's like America. It's like the very middle of America. So I think that growing up in Florida, even though it's part of the United States of America, it's not France where I was born, it just gives you a perspective that's interesting and helps you write about the rest of the United States. But I didn't realize how strange it was until I moved away. Like growing up basically with rockets going off outside my window and making things rattle in my house just seemed completely normal to me. So it actually took a long time for me to realize it was interesting enough to write a memoir about it, for example. I had to be someplace where when I mentioned it, people would look at me and go, instead of everybody going, yeah, I remember that. So, but I think it works with Iowa too. So it's like people in Iowa are not the people in New York who publish books. So, for example, my agent, who is a lifelong New Yorker of many, many generations, sent her child to Carleton in Minnesota for college. And when she was talking about taking her to Minnesota, you'd have thought it sounded like she took her in a Conestoga wagon. I was like, and then we drove and we drove and we drove. Anyway, so I think America is a very big place, and all of it's a little strange to everyone else, every other part of the country. But Florida, super strange, still is. Okay, that was the 2 questions. You can come up and talk to me afterwards. You can go have cookies. Thank you very much.
Buy her books, too.
Oh, there's some books for sale if anyone's interested.